Chapter 22 of The Charing Cross Mystery by J.S. Fletcher. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Highly Respectable Solicitor. Lord Morradale, who kept up honest country squire habits, even in London, had gone to bed when Heatherwick and Mapperley arrived at his house. But he lost little time in making an appearance, in pyjamas and dressing-gown, and listened eagerly to Heatherwick's account of the recent transactions. "Force," he muttered, nodding his head at each point of the story. "Force. Got it out of her by force. That is, if the order's genuine." Mapperley produced the sheet of paper, which he had filched under the caretaker's eyes, and silently handed it over. "Oh, that's Madame de Sorel's handwriting," exclaimed Lord Morradale. "Hers, without doubt. Difficult to imitate, of course. Oh, yes, hers. Well, that proves what I've just said, Mr. Heatherwick. Force. She's in their power. With the young lady, Miss Featherstone, to be sure, and they've made her write that. Next, they'll make her write an order on the Imperial Safe Deposit. We must be beforehand with them there. Early as possible in the morning. Meet me at Matherfield's. I think he's pretty keen. Bless me, what a pack of villains! I wonder where, in all London, these unfortunate ladies are." "That's precisely what all this ought to help us find out," remarked Heatherwick. "I'm not so much concerned about the valuables these men are after as about the safety of—" Lord Morradale gave him a quick, understanding glance. "Of Miss Featherstone, eh?" he said. I see. And I'm concerned, too, about Madame de Sorel. Well, this, as you say, ought to help. But look here, we must be cautious, very cautious. We mustn't let Matherfield, you know what the police are, we mustn't let him be too precipitate. Probably, if a man comes to the safe place, he'll go away from it to where those scoundrels are. We must follow. "I agree," said Heatherwick. 9 o'clock, then, at Matherfield's," concluded his lordship. "And may we have a strong scent, a rousing one, and a successful kill." With this bit of sporting phraseology in their ears, Heatherwick and Mapperley returned to the Middle Temple, and retired for the rest of the night, one to bed, the other to a shakedown on the sitting-room sofa. But when Heatherwick's alarm clock awoke him at 7:30, and he put his head into the next room to rouse the clerk, he found that Mapperley had vanished. The cushions, rugs, and blankets with which he had made himself comfortable for the night were all neatly folded and arranged. On the topmost was pinned a sheet of brief paper with a message scrawled in blue pencil. "You won't want me this morning. Off on an important notion of my own. Look out for messages from me about noon. M." Muttering to himself that he hadn't the least idea as to what his clerk was about, Heatherwick made a hurried toilet and an equally hurried breakfast, and hastened away to meet Matherfield and Lord Morradale. He found these two together, and with them a quiet, solemn-faced individual, clad in unusually sombre garments, whom Matherfield introduced as Detective Sergeant Quigman. Matherfield went straight to business. "His lordship's just told me of your adventure last night, Mr. Heatherwick," he said, "and I'm beginning to get a sort of forecast of what's likely to happen. It was, of course, Basvery who went to Madame's flat last night. That's settled. But what do you suppose he went for?" "Can't say that I've worked that out," answered Heatherwick with a glance at the others. "But I imagine that he went there to get, say, certain keys, having forced Madame de Sorel to tell him where they were. The keys of her safe at the deposit place, I should think." "No," replied Matherfield, shaking his head knowingly, and with a sly smile at Quigman. "No, not that. I'll tell you what he went for. A very simple thing. he went to get some of Madame's private note-paper. He knew well enough that if he was to take an order on that safe deposit to allow the bearer access to Madame's safe, it would have to be what the French, I believe, call en règle, written on her own note-paper, in her own handwriting, and so on. See? I think you're right, and I think he got it, said Heatherwick. A drawer in her desk, containing boxes of stationery, had been pulled out, and some of its contents lay about the desk. As a matter of fact, though I scarcely know why I did it, I put some paper and some envelopes in my pocket. Here they are. I had a faint idea that they might be useful somehow. Well, that's the notion, depend upon it, asserted Matherfield, glancing at the paper which Heatherwick produced. I've no doubt that somebody, representing Madame Listorel, and bearing an authorization from her, written on her note-paper, in her own writing, will present himself at the Imperial Safe Deposit this morning. But it won't be Basvery, and it won't be Ambrose. A stranger, suggested Heatherwick. We shall see. Now, continued Matherfield, glancing at the clock, we'll be off to the scene of operations. This Imperial Safe Deposit is in Kingsway, Holborn End, and very fortunately situated for our job, being close to the tube station. There'll be lots of people about there, and we shan't attract attention. And this is the way of it. His lordship and myself will go into the safe deposit, see the people in charge, explain matters, and get them to tell us at once if and when the expected ambassador arrives. We shall let him, or her, interrupted Quigman solemnly. Just so, my lad. It might be a she, assented Matherfield. Quite likely. We shall let him or her get what is wanted from the safe and go away, closely followed by all four of us. While Lord Morridale and I are inside, you and Quigman, Mr. Heatherwick, will be outside, talking casually. When we come out, and you'll both keep a sharp watch on the entrance hall, I'll give you the office as to the particular person we're following, and wherever that person goes, you two will go. But don't come near us. We'll keep on one side of the street, you the other. If the person takes a cab or a bus, well, we'll have to do the same. But I've reasons for thinking he or she will stick to his feet. How do we go? All together? Asked Heatherwick. Because it's a mere idea. How do you know, Matherfield, that these people, there would appear to be more than one concerned, aren't keeping an eye on you? I've thought of that, answered Matherfield. No, we're all going separately. It's now 9:15. That Imperial Safe Deposit doesn't open its doors till 10. Nobody can get in there until that time, anyway. We all four go out of this office on our own hook. Each takes his own method of getting to the top of Kingsway. As soon as I get there, I go straight in and ask for the manager. As soon as Lord Morridale gets there, he follows suit. He and I foregather in the manager's room. As for you two, go how you like. Fly, if it suits you, or wander round the side streets. But you meet right opposite the safe deposit entrance at precisely 10 o'clock, and under pretense of casual meeting and conversation, keep your eyes on it, noticing everybody who goes in and comes out. That clear? Then we all clear out, one by one. Outside, and left to his own devices, Heatherwick walked a little way and then hailed a taxicab. He gave his driver a confidential smile. You can just help me to employ 40 minutes, he said as he got in. Drive around, anywhere you like, up and down, as long as you put me down at the corner of the Holborn restaurant at precisely 2 minutes to 10. Got that? The driver comprehended, and began a leisurely journey round certain principal streets and thoroughfares. 2 minutes before 10, he pulled up at the Holborn Kingsway corner and gave his fare a grin. Done it to the second, sir, he announced, nodding at an adjacent clock. Good man, said Heatherwick. handing out something over the registered fare. Then an idea struck him. "Look here," he continued confidentially, "I and another man may have to follow somebody from here presently. Just drive down the street here, keeping your flag down, and wait. If I want you, I shall be close at hand." The driver showed his understanding by a nod and a wink, and moved a little distance off to the curbstone. Heatherwick walked slowly down the west side of Kingsway, and precisely as the clock struck 10, he saw Lord Morredale come from one direction and enter the formidable-looking and just-opened door of the safe deposit, and Matherfield appear from the other. Looking round again, he was aware of the solemn-faced Quigman, who sauntered round the corner of Parker Street and came towards him. Heatherwick went on to meet him. "There you are," he said, doing a little acting in case any inimical eyes were on him. "To the minute. We'd better appear to be doing a bit of talk, eh? The others have just gone in." "I saw 'em, sir," replied Quigman, coming to a halt on the curb, and affecting an interest in anything rather than on what he was really working. "Ah, but the question is, when will they come out? Might be in a few minutes, so to speak. Mightn't be for hours, as it were." "You seem to be a melancholy chap," observed Heatherwick. "Melancholy job," muttered Quigman. "Watching isn't my line. But Matherfield, he particularly wanted me to be in at this." "Why?" asked Heatherwick. "Peculiar knowledge of solicitors and their clerks in this part of London," replied Quigman. "My line. Matherfield, he's an idea that the order to open this safe will be presented by a solicitor." "Good Lord, has he?" exclaimed Heatherwick. "I wonder. But big help to these chaps, don't you see, if they can make a solicitor do the cat's paw work," suggested Quigman. "Who'd suspect a solicitor of the High Court? And as I know pretty nearly all of 'em, there's one I know now coming up t'other side of the street," he continued suddenly. "That tallish, thin, pale-faced chap, see him? Look at him without seeming to look. Now, I wonder if he's the party we want." Heatherwick looked in the direction indicated. He saw a youngish, spectacled man in a silk hat, morning coat, and the corresponding additions of professional attire, who was walking rapidly along from south to north. He was a very mild, gentle-looking person, not at all the sort to be concerned in dark plots and mysterious aims, and Heatherwick said so. "Aye, well, you never know," remarked Quigman lugubriously. "But, as I say, I know him. Mr. Garrowell. Mr. Octavius Garrowell, solicitor of St. Martin's Lane, that is. Been in practice for himself about 4 years or so. Nice young feller, quiet. And he is going in there, see?" Heatherwick saw. There were several people, men and women, entering the safe deposit just then, but Mr. Garrowell's silk hat and sloping shoulders made him easily identifiable. "I dessay it's him," observed Quigman with a sigh. "Just the sort to be took in, he is. Innocent, unsuspecting sort of gentleman. However, it mayn't be. Deal of people use these safe deposits nowadays." Mr. Garrowell disappeared. The two watchers waited. 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes went by. Then Mr. Garrowell came out. He came out just as any man would come out after transacting his business, quietly. Nobody followed him. Nobody seemed to be watching him from the safe deposit. But Heatherwick noticed at once that whereas he had entered carrying nothing but an umbrella, he now carried a small, square, leather-covered box. With this in his left hand, he crossed the roadway and advanced straight towards Heatherwick and Quigman. "No need to move, sir," whispered the detective. "Take no notice. Spot him, though." Mr. Garrowell, seen at close quarters, looked to be somewhat absent-minded, but chancing to look up as he stepped on the pavement, his eyes encountered Quigman, who touched his hat. "Morning, Mr. Garwell," said the detective. "Nice morning, sir." "Morning, Quigman," responded Mr. Garwell. "A very nice morning." He nodded smilingly and went on his way, and round the corner into Parker Street. Quigman glanced at Heatherwick and shook his head. "Not him," he said. "Matherfield's not following, and, as I said, we may have to wait hours." But at the end of another 10 minutes, Matherfield and Lord Moredale came together out of the entrance hall opposite. An official, smiling and talking, accompanied them to the threshold. When they left him, they came straight across the road, and it was obvious to Heatherwick that each was in a state of surprise, possibly of perplexity. Matherfield hailed them as soon as he was within speaking distance. "Here's a queer business," he said. "Did you see a professional-looking chap come away just now, who carried a small leather box?" "We saw Mr. Garrawell, solicitor, St. Martin's Lane," answered Quigman. "I know him. Gone down Parker Street." "It was Garrawell," assented Matherfield. "I know him too. Well," he turned to Heatherwick, "it's a queer business. They knew Garrawell across there. He's been to Madame de Stael's safe for her before. He came there just now with the usual authorization on her note paper, went to the safe, got that small box, and went. Garrawell, a highly respectable legal practitioner." "Why didn't you stop him and ask him questions?" inquired Heatherwick. Matherfield exchanged a glance with Lord Moredale. "Not there," he said. It looks as if Madame really had sent him. Her business." "Of course she'd sent him," exclaimed Heatherwick. "Sent him under compulsion. The whole thing's a clever plant. These fellows probably know that she's employed Garrawell now and then, and they forced her to write a letter to him, authorizing him to come here again, and enclosing an order on the safe deposit people. Don't you see?" "By gad, there's something in that, Matherfield," said Lord Moredale. "Didn't strike me, though. 'Pon my honour, I really thought he had come direct from her. Couldn't think why, exactly, but then, as Matherfield says, a highly respectable solicitor, eh?" "We'll soon settle it," exclaimed Matherfield suddenly. "We'll go to Garrawell's office. Better discuss it there than have tackled him here. Anyway, he'll have the square box. Quigman, call a taxi." "There's a man here waiting for me," said Heatherwick. He signalled to his former driver, who quickly came alongside. "For anything we know," he continued, as all four took their seats and were driven off, "Garrawell may have gone straight away somewhere to hand that box over. We ought to have followed." "I don't think so," replied Matherfield. "The whole thing's queer, and not at all what I expected. Lord Moredale says that he never heard of Madame employing Garrawell, and yet the safe people say he's been here 2 or 3 times on her business. But we'll soon have it out of him." End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of The Charing Cross Mystery by J.S. Fletcher. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Landlady of Little Smith Street. Garrawell's office proved to be up 2 flights of stairs in St. Martin's Lane. They were dark and dingy stairs, and none of the 4 men clambering up them noticed that an office boy, rushing unceremoniously downward, carried a small parcel with which he fled out of the door and away down the street. They were indeed thinking of Garrawell, and within 5 minutes they were all in his private room. For another 5 minutes Matherfield was explaining matters, explaining to an obviously startled and much astonished listener. "That's how it stands," concluded Matherfield. "You've evidently got the explanation, Mr. Garrawell. Now—" "But you surprise me," broke in the solicitor. "I've acted for Madame de Stael in 2 or 3 matters. I've got things from her safe for her before, once or twice, and I saw nothing unusual in the letter she sent me this morning. Here it is, you can see it. Her usual notepaper, certainly her handwriting. Nobody, I think, could imitate that successfully. You see what she says. I was to give the enclosed authorization to the safe people, take out a small, square, brown, leather-covered box from the safe, pack it up, and send it off to Mr. C. Basing, Post Office, Southampton, at once by express delivery. Nothing unusual in all that, I think. Of course, I carried out her wishes. But look at the letter. All four men were looking at the letter. It was as Garrawell described, and whether it had been written under duress or not, the writing was bold and firm. But Matherfield seized on the envelope, and after a glance at it, pointed to the postmark. "See that?" he exclaimed. "Posted in the S.W. district late last night. If Madame had been at home in Paddington, the postmark would have been different. Well, but the square box, Mr. Garrawell, you've got it, of course? Do you know that that box probably contains jewels worth—" "The box?" ejaculated Garrawell. "Got it? Of course not. It's gone. The boy went off to the post office with it, just before you came." "Gad!" muttered Lord Morrodale. "Well, the post office at once, Matherfield." But Matherfield suddenly laughed, throwing up both hands, as if with a sudden inspiration. "No, my lord, no," he said, "no. The box is safe enough in the post. It's off to Mr. C. Basing, Post Office, Southampton. And when Mr. Basing calls to collect it, he'll find me." There was triumphant conviction in Matherfield's tone. There was the impulse to immediate action, in the way in which he pulled out a railway guide from his pocket and rapidly turned its pages. But Heatherwick and Lord Morrodale looked at each other, and each saw that the other was dubious. "Yes," said Lord Morrodale slowly, "no doubt, Matherfield, but I say, you know, those jewels are worth no end. Safe enough, perhaps, in the hands of the postal authorities, now they are there, but there's many a slip, you know, and—" "You might take the postal authorities into your confidence," suggested Heatherwick. "These people are up to all sorts of wily tricks." Matherfield laughed quietly. It was the laugh of a man who knows his own business thoroughly, and is a little impatient of outside criticism. "I know what I'm doing, gentlemen," he answered. "Leave it to me as to what I do with the post office people. I've as good as got the handcuffs on Basvery, or on Ambrose, perhaps on both. This is how I figure the thing," he went on, with a final glance at the timetable. "These two men have got Madame Listorel and the young lady secretary in their power, safe somewhere in London. They forced Madame, last night, to write that letter to Mr. Garrawell here. We know what they made her write. Mr. Garrawell got the small box containing the jewels, and he's sent it off already, by express delivery, to Southampton. It will be there early this evening, and one or other of the men will be there to meet it. If Basvery calls for it, Ambrose will be round the corner. If Ambrose calls for it, Basvery will be close at hand. Probably they're already in Southampton. They'd go this morning to be on the spot. As soon as the box is in their hands, they'll be off, probably to the Continent, by Southampton and Havre. They won't try the Atlantic. The 5 days' voyage would be too risky. They'll make for France. But they won't get to France. They'll find themselves in the lock-up at Southampton before bedtime. You see if that doesn't come off, gentlemen, as sure as my name's what it is. Now, Quigman, you come with me. We've just nice time to catch the 1:30 and to get in touch with the Southampton police and lay our plans and make our arrangements. Sometime tonight, gentlemen, you'll hear from me." Then Netherfield hurried Quigman away, and the three men left behind looked at each other. Mr. Garrawell was obviously much concerned, and his hands, thin and nervous, trembled as he began to arrange the papers on his desk. "This is a most distressing business, gentlemen," he said. "It is very painful to me to think that I have been made an instrument in a crime of this sort, however innocent a one. But how could I tell that this letter was forced out of Madame Listorel? On the face of it—" "Oh, there's no blame attaching to you, Mr. Garrawell," interrupted Lord Morrodale. "On the face of it, the letter's genuine enough. But I wanted to ask you a question. How much do you know of Madame Listorel? I mean, how often has she employed you?" "2 or 3 times only," replied Garrawell. "She came to me first about an agreement which I had to send her on behalf of another client. She seemed very friendly, and was kind enough to say that next time she had any legal business she would remember me, as she hadn't any regular solicitor of her own. I think," he added, with a deprecating smile, "she probably saw that I was beginning and hadn't much to do." "I see," said Lord Morrodale, looking round at the somewhat humble appointments of the office. "And you've been to that safe-deposit place on her behalf how often?" "Twice. On each occasion Madame Listorel wrote her instructions from abroad. Once she was in Paris, the other time she was at Nice. The instructions were similar on both occasions. I was to go to the safe-deposit, get a certain parcel or article, and post it to an address given. The first time I sent a small parcel to Amsterdam. I have the exact address and name. The second to New York. So that, of course, when I got Madame's letter this morning, I saw nothing unusual in it." "Just so," agreed Lord Morrodale. "You wouldn't. Well, I hope Netherfield will clap the irons on the man who forced her to write it, eh, Heatherwick?" "With all my heart," responded Heatherwick. "But I, too, want to ask Mr. Garrawell a question. How long," he continued, "have you been here in St. Martin's Lane?" "Oh, 4 or 5 years," replied Garrawell. "Then you know this district pretty well, of course. Have you ever come across a man whom I'll try to describe to you?" He went on to give an accurate, if concise, description of Basvéry. "That man," he concluded, "is sometimes seen around here." Garrawell nodded. "I know him," he said. "In fact, he's been in this very room to see me. But I don't know his name, nor anything much about him. He was brought here by another man, and he only stayed a few minutes." "How much do you know about him, however little?" asked Heatherwick. "This much. You know that people who have invented things come to solicitors for legal advice, and sometimes to get information as to how they can best dispose of their inventions. Well, about 9 months ago a man came to me who claimed to have invented a drop bottle, that is, a bottle from which you could only drop 1 drop of stuff at a time. He said such a thing was badly wanted, and that there ought to be a pile of money in it. He wanted to know how best to get it on the market. I didn't know, but I mentioned the matter to 1 or 2 people, and a man I knew at that time, for he's since dead, unfortunately, said that he knew a man who was a sort of commission agent for inventions, took up a good idea, don't you see, and introduced it, and he promised to bring him to see me. He brought him. The man he brought was, without doubt, the man you describe. His name was not mentioned, but I'm sure he was that man. I don't know what your man is, but I felt sure that the man I am talking about either was or had been a medical man." "Ah!" exclaimed Heatherwick. "What made you think that?" "From his conversation, from the remarks he made about the bottle. He didn't take it up. He said my client was too late and was wrongly informed into the bargain. There was such a thing, and a superior one, already on the market. He went away then, and, as I say, I never heard his name, and I've never seen him since." "That's the man we want," said Heatherwick, "if Matherfield can only lay hands on him. But we shall know more by midnight." Outside, he turned to Lord Morrodale with a shake of his head. "We're no nearer to any knowledge of where the two women are," he exclaimed. "Oh, I don't know," responded Lord Morrodale. "I think we are, you know. You see, if Matherfield nabs those chaps, or even one of them, he or they will see that the game's up, and will give in and say where their captives are. Odd business, Heatherwick, that people can be kidnapped and imprisoned in broad daylight in London." "I don't think there's anything impossible or odd in London," answered Heatherwick dryly. "If one had only the least idea as to which quarter of the town that car was driven, one might be doing something." "Lots of subsections in every quarter, and subsections again in each of those," replied Lord Morrodale, with equal dryness. "Takes some time to comb out this town. No, I think we must trust to Matherfield. Nothing else to trust to, in fact." But Heatherwick suddenly thought of Mapperley. He began to wonder what the clerk was after, what his notion had been. Then he remembered Mapperley's admonition to look out for a message about that time, and, excusing himself from Lord Morrodale, he jumped on a bus and went along to the Temple. There, in the letter-box, he found a telegram. "Meet me, Victoria, 3 o'clock. Mapperley." Heatherwick set off for Victoria there and then. But it was only 2:15 when he got there, and as he had had no lunch, he turned into the restaurant. There, when he was halfway through a chop, Mapperley found him, and slipped into a chair close by before Heatherwick noticed his presence. "Thought I might find you in here, sir," said Mapperley. They were alone in a quiet corner, but the clerk lowered his voice to a whisper. "Well," he continued, bending across the table, "I've done a bit, anyhow." "In what way?" asked Heatherwick. Mapperley produced from his breast pocket some papers, and from amongst them selected an envelope, the azure-tinted envelope which he had picked up from the caretaker's supper-table at St. Mary's Mansions. "You recognize this?" he said with a sly smile. "You know where I got it? This is the envelope which Basvely took to the caretaker, with the order to enter Madame de Storen's flat. You knew that I carried it off from under the man's nose last night, but you didn't know why. I only laughed when you asked me." "Well, why then?" inquired Heatherwick. "This reason," replied Mapperley. "We both noticed that the sheet of paper on which the order had been written by Madame had been shortened. There was no doubt that a printed or embossed address had been trimmed off, rather roughly, too. We noticed that, I say, both of us. But I don't think you noticed something far more important. Far, far more important for our purposes." "No," admitted Heatherwick, "I didn't. What?" "This," said Mapperley, turning back the broken flap of the envelope. "You didn't notice that here on the envelope is the name and address of the stationer who supplied the stuff. There you are, W. H. Culkin, 85 Broadway, Westminster. You never saw that, Mr. Heatherwick, but I did." Heatherwick began to comprehend. He smiled gratefully. "Smart of you, Mapperley," he exclaimed. "I see. And you've been there." "I've been there," answered Mapperley. "I saw a chance of tracking these men down. I couldn't get hold of Calkin till nearly noon, but got on like a house afire when I did get him. You see," he went on, "that paper is, to start with, of an unusual tint in colour. Secondly, it's of very superior quality, though very thin, intended chiefly for foreign correspondence. Thirdly, it's expensive. Now, I felt certain its use would be limited, and what I wanted to find out from the stationer was to whom he'd supplied it. That was easy. He recognized the paper and envelope at once. Of the handwriting on the paper he knew nothing whatever, Madame's writing, you know. that he'd never seen before, but he said at once that he'd only supplied that particular make of paper and envelope to 3 people, and for each person he'd prepared a die to emboss the address. The embossing had been done at his shop, and he showed me specimens of each. One was for the Dowager Lady Markentree, 120 Grosvenor Gardens. That was no use. The second was for Miss Chellandry, 87 Ebury Street. That was out of count, too. But the third was what I wanted. It was just the address, 56 Little Smith Street, Southwest 1. As soon as I saw it, I knew I'd got onto the right track. "Go on," said Heatherwick. "The stationer, Calkin, didn't know the name of the man who ordered this paper and gave this address," continued Mapperley. "He knew him well enough as a customer, though, and described him. Bazveri, without a doubt. Calkin says that Bazveri, during the last few months, bought various items of stationery from him, notebooks, duplicating paper, office requisites, and so on. He never knew his name, but as he always carried away his own purchases and paid spot cash for them, that didn't matter. Calkin supplied him with 10 quires of this paper and envelopes to match a couple of months ago. So there you are. And there I was, sure at last that Bazveri's mysterious hiding-place was 56 Little Smith Street." "Good, good," said Heatherwick. "What next?" "Well, I thought we could do with a bit of help," replied Mapperley, smiling. "So I left Calkin, bound to secrecy, of course, and telephoned to Issy Goldmark. Issy is just the sort of chap for games of this sort. Issy came, and he and I took a stroll round. Do you know Little Smith Street?" "Not I," answered Heatherwick. "Never heard of it." "Oh, well, but it is a street," said Mapperley. "It lies between Great Smith Street and Tufton Street, back at the church house, not so far from the Abbey. Bit slummy down those quarters, roundabout. Sort of district that's seen decidedly better days. Still, there's good, solid houses there. 56 is one of 'em. From outside, it looks the sort of house you can't get into. Dark, silent, heavily curtained windows, sort of place in which you could murder anybody on the quiet. Very substantial front door, painted dark green, with an old-fashioned brass knocker. That sort of house. We took a good look at it." "See anything?" asked Heatherwick. "Nothing but what I've told you. Lifeless sort of place," answered Mapperley. "However, having once seen it, I wasn't going to leave it unwatched. So I posted Issy there, in the window of a convenient public-house, and came away to telegraph to you. And there Issy is, either in his pub or loafing around. And now we ought to go and hear if he's anything to report. And if he hasn't, what then?" "Just so," said Heatherwick. "That's it. What then? But before we do anything at all, Mapperley, I'd better post you up as to what's happened elsewhere this morning. You see," he continued, when he had finished his story, "if Matterfield's theory is correct, and Bazveri has already gone to Southampton to collect that parcel on its arrival, and if Ambrose has gone with him, we shan't find Bazveri at this address. But we might inquire if he's known there." Mapperley reflected a while. Then an idea seemed to suggest itself. "Pay your bill, sir, and let's get out to a post-office directory somewhere," he said. "We'll get the name of the occupier of 56 Little Smith Street." 10 minutes later, they were looking down the long columns of names in a directory. Mapperley suddenly pointed to what they wanted. "There we are," he said. "Mrs. Hannah Mallet, boarding-house proprietor." "Come along," said Heatherwick. "We'll see Mrs. Mallet, anyhow." But on arrival at Little Smith Street, Mapperley looked round first for his friend Mr. Goldmark. Mr. Goldmark materialized suddenly, apparently from nowhere, and smiled. "Afternoon, mister," he said politely to Heatherwick. Lovely weather, isn't it? Ain't seen nothin', Mapperly, old bean. Ain't been a soul in or out of that house since you hopped it. Seems to me it's locked up." "We'll see about that," remarked Heatherwick. "Come with me, Mapperly. You stay here, Goldmark, and keep your eyes as open as before." He advanced boldly, with the clerk at his heels, to the door of number 56, and knocked loudly on the stout panel, supplementing this with a ring at the bell. The dual summons was twice repeated, with no result. "Somebody coming," whispered Mapperly suddenly, "bolted inside as well as locked." Heatherwick distinctly heard the sound of a stout bolt being withdrawn, then of a key being turned. The door was opened, only a little, but sufficiently to show them the face and figure of an unusually big woman, an Amazon in appearance, hard of eye and lip, who glared at them suspiciously as soon as she saw that there were two of them, narrowed the space through which she inspected her callers. But Heatherwick got a hand on the door and a foot across the threshold. "Mrs. Mallet?" he inquired, in a purposely loud voice. "Just so. Is Dr. Busvely in?" Both men were watching the woman keenly, and they saw that she started a little, involuntarily. But her head shook a ready negative. "Nobody of that name here," she answered. She would have shut the door, but for Heatherwick's foot. He advanced it further, giving Mrs. Mallet a keen, searching glance. "Perhaps you know Dr. Busvely by another name," he suggested. "So, is Mr. Basing in?" But the ready shake of the head came again, and the hard eyes grew harder and more suspicious. "Nobody of that name here either," she said. "Don't know anybody of those names." "I think you do," persisted Heatherwick sternly. He turned to Mapperly purposely. "We shall have to get the police." "Look out, sir!" exclaimed Mapperly, snatching at Heatherwick's arm. "Your fingers!" The woman suddenly banged the door to, narrowly missing Heatherwick's hand, which he had closed on the edge. A second later they heard the bolt slipped and the key turned, and Heatherwick, as with a swift illumination, comprehended things and turned sharply on his clerk. "Mapperly, sure as fate," he exclaimed, "those ladies are in there, trapped." "Shouldn't wonder, sir," agreed Mapperly. "And, as you say, the police—" "Come back to Goldmark," said Heatherwick. Going lower down the street, and retreating into the shelter of a doorway, the three men held a rapid consultation, suddenly interrupted by an exclamation from the Jew, who still kept his eyes on the house. "S'help me if the woman ain't leavin' the house," he said. See? Locking the door behind her, going up the street." Heatherwick looked and saw, and pushed Goldmark out of the doorway. "Follow," he said, "and for God's sake don't miss her." End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of The Charing Cross Mystery by J.S. Fletcher. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The House in the Yard. The Jew silently and promptly set out in the wake of the hurrying woman. Presently she and her pursuer disappeared round a corner. "That's the result of our call, Mapperly," said Heatherwick. "She's gone somewhere to tell somebody." "Likely," assented Mapperly. "But wherever she's gone, Issy Goldmark'll spot her. He's the eyes of a lynx." "He let Busvely slip him the other night, though," remarked Heatherwick. "Well, there was some excuse for that," said Mapperly. "To begin with, he was only instructed to find out where Busvely went, and to end with, he had found out. He'll not let this woman slip him. She's good to follow, plenty of her." "I wish we knew what she'd left in that house," said Heatherwick. "We'll have to find out somehow." "That's a police job," replied Mapperly. "Can't walk into people's houses without a warrant. And you say Matherfield's on the other track? However, I should say that this woman's gone off now to find somebody who's principally concerned. She looked afraid, in my opinion, when she saw me." "She's in it somehow," muttered Heatherwick. "That house looks mysterious enough for anything. We'll keep a close watch on it, anyway, until Goldmark comes back, however long that may be." But the Jew was back within 20 minutes. So was the woman. She came first, hurrying up the street quicker than when she had left it. As far as the watchers could make out from their vantage point, 20 yards away from her door, she looked flustered, distressed, upset. After her, on the opposite pavement, came Mr. Issy Goldmark, his hands in his pockets. The woman re-entered the house. They heard the door bang. A moment later, the Jew turned into the entry in which Heatherwick and Mapperley stood, half hidden from the street. He smiled inscrutably. "See her go back to her house?" he asked. "Well, I followed. I saw where she'd been, too." "Where, then?" demanded Heatherwick impatiently. Goldmark jerked his head in the direction from whence he had come. "Round that corner," he said. "You get into a regular slum. Little streets, alleys, passages, and so on. In one of 'em, a narrow place, where there's a sort of open-air market, with a good stiff-piece blank wall, with an iron-fastened door on it. Well, the woman went in there, let herself in with a key that she took from her pocket. As soon as she'd gone in, I took a closer look. The door's fastened with iron or steel. As I said, solid strong. There ain't no name on it, and no keyhole that you can look through. The wall's a good 9 or 10 feet high, and it's covered with broken glass at the top. Not a nice place to get into, nohow." "Well?" inquired Heatherwick. "She went in?" "Went in, as I say, Mr., and the door closed on her. After I'd taken a glimpse at the door, I got a pass behind one of the stalls in the street and watched. She came out again in about 10 minutes. Looked to me, too, as if she hadn't had a very pleasant time inside. Upset. And she set off back here, faster than what she came. Now she's gone into her house again, as you no doubt saw. And that's all. But if I was you, mister," concluded Issy, "I should just find out what is behind that door and the wall in there. I should do that, though." "That's a police job," said Mapperley once more. "If we'd only got Matterfield with us, we could—" Heatherwick paused, thinking. "Look here, Mapperley," he continued with a sudden inspiration. "I know what we'll do. You get a taxicab as quickly as possible. Drive to the police station where I usually meet Matterfield. There's another man there whom I know, and who's pretty well up in this business, Detective Sergeant Robmore. Ask for him. Tell him what we've discovered, and ask him to come back with you, to bring another man if he thinks necessary. Now then, Goldmark, tell Mapperley exactly where this place is." The Jew pointed along the street to its first corner. "Round that corner," he said, "first turning to the right, then first to the left, then first to the right. That's the spot. Lots of little cells and a bitty crowded place." "Did you notice the name?" demanded Mapperley, half scoldingly. "To be sure I did," grinned Goldmark. "Pencove Street. But it's better to describe it than name it. And don't you go tellin' no taxi driver to take you in there, 'cause there ain't room." Mapperley gave no answer to this piece of advice. He shot off in the direction of Victoria Street, and Heatherwick turned to the Jew. "We'll go and have another look at this place, Goldmark," he said, "but we'll go separately, as long as we're in this street, anyway. You stroll off to that first corner, and I'll join you." He crossed the street when the Jew had lounged away, and once more took a narrow look at the house into which the big woman had vanished. It was as close barred and curtained as ever, a veritable place of mystery. For a moment Heatherwick doubted whether he ought to leave it unwatched, but the descriptions of the wall and door in Pencove Street had excited his imagination, and he went on, turned a corner, and rejoined Goldmark. Goldmark at once went in front, piloting him into a maze of unusually dirty and crowded streets, and finally into one, narrower than the rest, on each side of which were tent-like stalls, whereon all manner of cheap wares were being offered for sale by raucous-voiced vendors. He saw at once that this was one of those open-air markets, of which there are many in the poorer neighbourhoods of London, and wherein you can buy a sixpenny frying-pan as readily as a paper of fried fish and a gay neckerchief alongside a damaged orange. Threading his way behind Issy, and between the thronged stalls and miserable shops that lined the pavement, Heatherwick presently came to the piece of blank wall which the Jew had told him about. The houses and shops around were old and dilapidated, but the wall was either modern or had been rebuilt and strengthened. It stretched between two low houses, one used as a grocer's, the other as a hardware shop. In length it was some 30 feet, in height quite 10. Its coping, as Goldmark had said, was liberally embattled with broken glass. The door, set flush with the adjoining masonry, was a solid affair, faced with metal, newly painted, and the lock was evidently a patent one. A significant fact struck Heatherwick at once. There was no sign of a bell, and none of a knocker. "You say the woman let herself in here?" he asked, as he and Issy paused. "That's it, Mr. Heatherwick, let herself in," replied Issy. "I see her take the key from her pocket." Heatherwick glanced at the top of the wall. "I wonder what's behind that," he muttered. "Building of some sort, of course." He turned to a man whose stall stood just in front of the mysterious door, and who at that moment had no trade. "Do you know anything about this place?" he asked. "Do you know what's behind this wall? What building it is?" The stall-keeper eyed Heatherwick over, silently and carefully. Deciding that he was an innocent person, and not a policeman in plain clothes, he found his tongue. "I don't, governor," he answered. "Ain't a bloomin' notion. I been comin' here, or hereabouts, this 3 year or more, but I ain't never seen behind that wall, nor in at that there doorway, s'help me." "But I suppose you've seen people go in and come out of the door?" suggested Heatherwick. "It must be used for something." "I reckon it is, governor, but I don't call nobody to mind, though. To be sure, I see a woman come out of it a while ago, big, heavy-jawed woman she was. But queer as it may seem, I don't call to mind ever seen anybody else. You see, governor, I comes here at about 10 o'clock of a morning, and I packs up and ops it at 5. If there's folks come in and out of that spot, it must be early in a morning and late at night, so I shouldn't see 'em. But it's my belief this here wall and door is back premises to something. The front of the place'll be on the other side." "That's a good idea," said Heatherwick, with a glance at Goldmark. "Let's go round." But there was no going round. Although they tried various alleys and passages and streets that ought to have been parallel to Pencove Street, they failed to find any place that could be a frontage to the mysterious wall and its close-set door. But the Jew's alert faculties asserted themselves. "We can see what's behind that wall, mister, easy enough, if we get one of them shopkeepers opposite to let us go upstairs to the first floor. Look right across the street there, stalls and all, into whatever there is. Try that one," he said, pointing to a greengrocer's establishment which faced the close-set door. "Tell him we're doing a bit of land surveying, which is true." Heatherwick made his request. The greengrocer's lady showed him and Goldmark upstairs into a bow-windowed parlour, one of those dismal apartments which are only used on Sundays for the purpose of adding more gloom to a gloomy day. She observed that there was a nice view both ways of the street, but Heatherwick confined his inspection to the front. He saw across the wall easily enough now. There was little to see. The wall bounded a yard, bounded on its left and right sides by the walls of the adjoining houses, and at its further extremity by a low, squat building of red brick, erected against the rear of a high windowless wall beyond. From its mere aspect, it was impossible to tell what this squat, flat-roofed structure was used for. Its door, closed, was visible. Visible, too, were the windows on either side, but it was easy to see that they were obscured, as to their lower halves, by coats of dark paint. There was no sign over the building, no outward indication of its purpose. In the yard, however, were crates, boxes, and carboys in wicker cases. A curiously shaped chimney, projecting from the roof above, suggested the presence of a furnace or forge beneath, and Heatherwick, after another look, felt no doubt that he was gazing at the place to which Hannaford had been taken, and where he had been skilfully poisoned. Goldmark suddenly nudged his arm, and nodded at the crowded street below. "Mapperley," he whispered, "and 2 men with him." Heatherwick, glancing in the direction indicated, saw Robmore and another man, both in plain clothes, making their way down the street, between the stalls and shops. With them, and in close conversation, was a uniformed constable. He turned to leave the room, but Goldmark again touched his elbow. "Before we go, mister," he said, "just take another glance at that place opposite and its surroundings. I see where we can get in. D'ye see, Mr. Heatherwick, the wall between that yard and the next house, the right-hand side one? It's fairly low at the far end. Now, if the man in that house would let us go through to his backyard, what?" "I see," agreed Heatherwick. "We'll try it. But Robmore first. Come along." He slipped some silver into the hand of the greengrocer's lady, and went down to the street. A brief explanation to the 2 detectives supplemented the information already given them by Mapperley, and then Robmore nodded at the constable who stood by, eagerly interested. "We've been talking to him, Mr. Heatherwick," he said. "He's sometimes on day duty here, and sometimes he's on night. He says he's often wondered about this place, and it's a very queer thing that, though he's known this district more than a year, he's never seen a soul go in or out of that door, and hasn't the least notion of what business, if it is a business, is carried on there." "Never seen anything or anybody," corroborated the constable, "at any time, day or night. When I first came on this beat, maybe 15 months ago, that door had been newly set and painted, and the glass had just been stuck atop of the wall. But it's a fact, I've never seen anybody go in or come out." "I propose to go in," said Heatherwick. "I think we've abundant cause, knowing what we do. It may be that the 2 missing ladies are there. I've been having a look into the yard, and we could get into it easily by going through the grocer's shop there on the right, and climbing the wall from his back premises. What do you say, Robmore?" "Oh, I think so," agreed Robmore. "Now we're on the job, we'll carry it through. Better let me tackle the grocer, Mr. Heatherwick. I'll see him first, and then call you in." The other waited while Robmore entered the shop and spoke with its owner. They saw him engaged in conversation for several minutes. Then he came to the door and beckoned the rest to approach. "That's all right," he said in an aside to Heatherwick. "We can go through to his backyard, and he'll lend us a step-ladder to get over the wall. But he's told me a bit. He knows the 2 men who have this place in the next yard, and there's no doubt at all, from his description of them, that one of 'em's Ambrose and the other is Buzz-Very. He says they've had the place almost 18 months, and he thinks they use it as a laboratory, chemicals or something of that sort. But he says they're rarely seen. Sometimes he's never seen them for days and even weeks together. Usually they're there of a night. He's seen lights in the place at all hours of the night. Well, come on." The posse of investigators filed through the dark little shop to a yard at its rear, the grocer's apprentice going in front with a step-ladder, which he planted against the intervening wall at its lowest point. One by one, the uniformed constable going first, the 6 men climbed and dropped over. But for their own presence, the place seemed deserted and lifeless. As Heatherwick had observed from the greengrocer's parlour, the windows were obscured by thick coats of paint. Nevertheless, 2 or 3 of the men approached and tried to find places from which the paint had been scratched, in an effort to see what lay inside. But the constable, bolder and more direct, went straight to the entrance. "Door's open!" he exclaimed. "Not even shut!" He pushed the door wide and went into the building, the rest crowding after him. "Hullo!" he shouted. "Hullo!" No answer came to the summons. The constable crossed the lobby, in which they were all standing, and opened an inner door, and Heatherwick saw at once that the grocer's surmise as to the purpose to which the place was put had been correct. This was a chemical laboratory, well equipped, too, with modern apparatus, but there was not a sign of life in it. "Nobody here, apparently," murmured one of the men. "Flown." Robmore went forward to another door, and, opening it, revealed a room furnished as an office. There was a roll-top desk in it, and papers and documents lying there. He and Heatherwick began to finger and examine them, and Heatherwick suddenly saw something that made a link between this mysterious place and the house he had called at earlier in the afternoon. There, before his eyes, lay some of the azure-tinted note-paper, which Mapperley had traced with the embossed address on it of which the stationer had told. "There's no doubt we've hit the place at last, Robmore," he said. "I wish we'd had Matherfield here, but—" Before he could say more, a sudden shout came from Goldmark, who, while the others were investigating the lower regions, had courageously and alone gone up the low staircase to the upper rooms. Mr. Heatherwick, come up here. Come up, all of you. Here's a man here, a-sittin' in a chair, and to help me, if I don't believe he's a stiff 'un. Dead." End of chapter 24. Chapter 25 of The Charing Cross Mystery by J.S. Fletcher. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Dead. The rest of the searchers, hearing that startled cry from the Jew, with one accord made for the upper part of the building. Robmore and Heatherwick reached him first. He was standing at the half-opened door of a room into which he was staring with eager eyes. They pushed by him and entered. Heatherwick took in the general aspect and contents of that room at a glance. It had been fitted up recently, he thought, from certain small evidences, as a bed-sitting-room. A camp bed stood in one corner. There was a washstand, a dressing-table, a chest of drawers, 2 or 3 pictures, a shelf of books, a small square of carpet in the centre of the floor, the outer edges of which had been roughly and newly stained. On the bed lay, open, a suitcase already packed with clothes and linen. By it lay an overcoat, hat, gloves, umbrella. It was evident that the man to whom it belonged had completed his preparations for a departure, and had nothing to do but to close and lock the suitcase, put on his overcoat and hat, pick up the other things, and go away. But the man himself? There was a big, old-fashioned easy-chair at the side of the bed, a roomy, comfortable affair. A man lay, rather than sat, in it, in an attitude which suggested that he had dropped there, as with a sudden weariness, laid his head back against the padded cushions, and gone to sleep. But the men knew, all of them, as they crowded into that room, that it was no sleep that they had broken in upon. It was death. This, as the Jew had been quick to see, was a dead man. Dead. Heatherwick took him in as quickly as he had taken in his surroundings. His head lay quietly against the padding of the chair, a little inclined to his left shoulder. The face was fully visible. It was, to Heatherwick, the face of a stranger. In all his and Matherfield's investigations, it had not been described to them. Yet he was certain that he was looking on the man known to them by repute as Ambrose, disguised, of course. He had shaved off the dark beard and moustache of which they had heard, and he could see at once that the loss of them had made a remarkable difference in his appearance. But nothing could disguise his height and general build. This, without doubt, was the man Matherfield and he had hunted for, the man who had met Hannaford at Victoria, who had disappeared from his flat in the Adelphi, the man who was associated with Basvery, and who— "Dead as a doornail," muttered Robmore. "And he's been dead a good bit, too. Some hours, anyhow. Stiff. Do you know him, Mr. Heatherwick?" Heatherwick said what he thought. Robmore pointed to the things on the bed. "Looks as if he'd been taken with a seizure just as he was about to set off somewhere," he remarked. "Well, if this is the Dr. Ambrose we've been seeking. But let's see if he's got anything on him to prove his identity." While the rest of the men stood by watching, he put his hand into the dead man's inside breast pocket. He was wearing a smart, brand-new grey tweed suit. Heatherwick later on remembered how its newness struck him as being incongruously out of place somehow, and drew out a pocket-book. Touching Heatherwick's elbow and motioning him to follow him, he went over to the window, leaving the others still staring wonderingly at the dead man. "This is a queer business, Mr. Heatherwick," he whispered as they drew apart. "You think this is the Ambrose we were after?" "Sure of it," answered Heatherwick. "He's shaved off his beard and moustache, and that's no doubt made a big difference in his appearance. But you may depend upon it, this is the man. But what's caused his sudden death?" Then a keen, vivid recollection flashed in upon him, and he turned sharply, glancing at the rigid figure in the background. "What is it?" asked Robmore curiously. "Something strikes you?" Heatherwick pointed to the dead man's attitude. That's just how Hannaford looked when he died in the railway carriage," he whispered. "After the first signs, you know, he laid back and died, just like that, as if he'd dropped quietly asleep. Can it be that—" "I know what you're thinking," muttered Robmore. "Poisoned. Well, what about the other man?" "Basvery," exclaimed Heatherwick. "Why not? To rid himself of an accomplice? But this pocket-book," said Robmore. "Let's see what's in it. Doesn't seem to be anything very much by the thinness." From one flap of the pocket-book he drew out a wad of carefully folded banknotes, and rapidly turned them over. £150 there, he remarked. "And what's this paper? A draft on a New York bank for 200. New York, eh? So that's where he was bound. And this," he went on, turning out the other flap. "Ah, see this, Mr. Heatherwick? He'd got his passage booked by the Mahratic, sailing tonight. And Matherfield's gone to Southampton after Basvery. I'm beginning to see a bit into this, I think." "What do you see?" asked Heatherwick. "Well, it looks to me as if Basvery had gone ahead to collect that box containing the jewels, and that Ambrose was to follow later, join him there, when Basvery had secured the loot, and that they were then to be off with their harvest. But do you notice this, the name under which the passage is booked? Not Ambrose. Charles Andrews, Esquire. Andrews. And Basvery is Basing and Andrews. Now I wonder if they carried on business here under those names." "That's an important detail," said Heatherwick. "The important thing surely is that. How did that man come by his death?" "Well, but I don't think that is very important just now," replied Robmore. "After all, he is dead, and whether he died as the result of a sudden seizure, or whether Vasveli cleverly poisoned him before he left, is a question we'll have to settle later. But I'll tell you what, Mr. Heatherwick, I'll lay anything he didn't poison himself. Look round. There isn't a sign of anything he's been drinking out of. No, sir, the other man's done this. And if Matherfield has the luck to lay hands on him tonight... But now, what was this your clerk Mapperly told us as we came along about the Little Smith Street landlady coming in here this afternoon? She was followed here by Goldmark, replied Heatherwick. Goldmark saw her admit herself by a key which she took from her pocket. She stayed inside a few minutes, came out looking much upset, and hurried away to her own house. And now you and I'll just hurry after her, said Rodmore. After all, she's living, and we'll make her find her tongue. Of course she came in here expecting to find this man, and to tell him somebody was on the lookout, and she found him dead. Come round there with me, Mr. Heatherwick, at once. He turned to the other detective and the constable, and after giving instructions left the room. Heatherwick, after a word or two with Mapperly, following him. But before they had reached the outer door, they heard steps in the yard, and suddenly 2 men appeared in the doorway. If Heatherwick and his companion looked questioningly at these 2 men, they, on their part, looked questioningly at Rodmore and Heatherwick. They were youngish men. Heatherwick set them down as respectably dressed artisans. That they were surprised to find anyone confronting them at the door, whereat all 4 now stood, was evident. Their surprise indeed was so great that they came to a sudden halt, staring silently. But Rodmore spoke. "Wanting somebody?" he asked sharply. The 2 strangers exchanged a glance, and the apparently elder one replied, "Well, no," he said. "Not that we know of, but might we ask if you are, and how you got in here? Because this place happens to be ours." "Yours!" exclaimed Rodmore. "Your property?" "Well, if buying it, paying for it, and taking a receipt and papers makes it so," answered the man. "Bought it this morning, and settled up for it, too, anyway." Rodmore produced and handed over a professional card, and the faces of the 2 men fell as they read it. The elder looked up quickly. "I hope there's nothing wrong," he said anxiously. "Detectives, eh? We've laid out a nice bit on this. Savings, too. And—" "I don't suppose there's anything wrong that way," replied Rodmore reassuringly. "But there's something uncommonly wrong in other ways. Now, look here. Who are you 2, and from whom did you buy this place?" "My name's Marshall. His is Wilkinson," answered the leader. "We're just starting business for ourselves as electrical engineers. We advertised for a likely place hereabouts, and Mr. Andrews came to us about this. Said he and his partner, Mr. Basing, were leaving, and wanted to sell it, just as it stood. We came to look at it, and as it's just the place we need to start with, we agreed to buy it. They said it was their own property, and to save law expenses, we carried out the purchase between ourselves. And we paid over the purchase money this morning, and got the papers and the key." "What time was that?" asked Rodmore. 10 o'clock, or thereabouts," replied Marshall. "By appointment, here." "Did you see both men, Basing and Andrews?" "Both, in that little room to the right. We settled the business, paid them in cash, settled it all up. It was soon done. And then they stood us a drink and a cigar, and we went." "Stood you a drink, eh?" said Rodmore. "Where?" "Here, Basing. He pulled out a big bottle of champagne and a cigar box, and said we'd wet the bargain. We'd a glass apiece, Wilkinson and me, and then we left 'em to finish the bottle. We were in a hurry. But is anything wrong?" "What is wrong, my lad, is that the man you know as Andrews is lying dead upstairs. replied Rodmore. "Poisoned, most likely, by his partner. But, as I said just now, I don't suppose there's anything wrong about your buying the property, providing you can show a title to it. You say you've got the necessary papers?" Marshall clapped a hand on the pocket of his coat. "Got them all here now," he said. "But did you say Andrews was dead? Poisoned?" "Why, he was as alive as I am when we left the two of 'em together. They were finishing the bottle." "Look here," interrupted Rodmore. "Wait a while until we come back. We've some important work close by. There are people of ours upstairs. Tell them I said that you were to wait a bit. Now, Mr. Heatherwick." Outside the yard and in a crowded street, Rodmore turned to his companion with a cynical laugh. Champagne to wet the bargain. Left them to finish it, eh? And no doubt what finished Ambrose was in that champagne, slipped in by Basveli when his back was turned. I'll tell you what it is, Mr. Heatherwick, that chap's a thorough paston. He goes the whole hog. I only hope he won't be too deep for Matherfield at Southampton. I shall be anxious till I hear." "Is it possible for him to escape Matherfield?" exclaimed Heatherwick. "How can he? I look on him as being as good as in custody already. He's bound to call at the post office for that box." "Is he, though?" interrupted the detective with another incredulous laugh. "I'm not so sure about that. Basveli is evidently an accomplished scoundrel, and full of all sorts of tricks. I'll tell ye what I'm wondering. Will that parcel ever get to the Southampton post office, where it's to be called for?" "Whatever do you mean?" demanded Heatherwick. "It's in the post, posted this morning." "No doubt," agreed Rodmore dryly. "By special delivery, eh? And when it gets to Southampton station, it's got to be taken to the head post office, hasn't it?" "Well?" "There's many a slip 'twixt cup and lip, so the old saying goes," replied Rodmore. "That parcel may slip. But isn't this the number your clerk mentioned?" The door of Mrs. Mallett's house looked more closely barred than ever, if possible, and no answer came to several summonses by bell and knocker. But presently Rodmore tried the handle. The door opened at his touch. "Hello!" he exclaimed. "Open? That seems a bit queer. Well, inside." For the second time that afternoon, Heatherwick walked into a place that seemed to be wholly deserted. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of The Charing Cross Mystery by J.S. Fletcher. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Waterloo. The detective, walking a little in advance of his companion, stepped forward to a hall table and knocked loudly on its polished surface. No answer came. He went further along, to the head of a railed stair, which evidently communicated with a cellar kitchen. Again he knocked, more loudly than before, on an adjacent panel, and again got no reply. And at that, turning back along the hall, he opened the door of the room which faced upon the street, and he and Heatherwick looked in. A musty-smelling, close-curtained room that, a sort of Sunday parlour, little used, cold, and comfortless in its formality. But the room behind it, to which Rodmore turned next, showed signs of recent occupancy and life. There was a fire in the grate, with an easy-chair drawn near to it. On the table close by lay women's gear, a heap of linen with needle and thread thrust in, a work-basket, scissors, thimble. It required no more than a glance to see that the owner of these innocent matters had laid them down suddenly interrupted in her task. "I'll tell you what it is, Mr. Heatherwick," exclaimed Rodmore abruptly. "This house is empty of people, anyway. "Silent enough, to be sure," agreed Heatherwick. "The woman, you've frightened her by calling here," said Rodmore. "Then she slipped round to Pencove Street, and there she found Ambrose dead. She's some connection with him and Bazvery, because she possesses a key that admits you to that yard, and finding Ambrose dead, she came back here, got her things, and cleared out. There isn't a soul in this house. I'll lay anything on that." "It struck me that this might be the place where the two ladies were detained," remarked Heatherwick. "We'll soon see about that," declared Rodmore. "Come upstairs. We'll search the place from top to bottom. But stop downstairs first." He ran down the stair to the cellar kitchen, with Heatherwick at his heels, and at the door he laughed, pointing within. "Look there!" he exclaimed. "I told you you'd interrupted things. See, there's one tea-tray laid out all ready for two, cups and saucers, teapot, bread and butter cut, cake. There's another for one, and there's the kettle singing away like a bird on a bough. What's that mean? The woman was going to carry up tea for two somewhere. T'other tray was for herself. Well, you nip that in the bud. She'll have to get her tea somewhere. But the others. Come upstairs." Going back to the hall, he led the way up the main staircase. There were 2 stories above the ground floor. On the first were rooms the doors of which, being opened or being found open, revealed nothing but ordinary things. Of these rooms there were 3, opening off a main landing. But on the next floor there were only 2 rooms. One was unfurnished. At the door of the other, a few inches ajar, the detective immediately paused. "Look you there now, Mr. Heatherwick," he said, pointing here and there. "Here's recent work. Do you see that a strong bolt, more like a bar, has been fitted on the outside of this door? And the door itself fitted with a new patent lock? Ah, good Lord, a chain as well. Might as well be in jail. But what's inside?" He pushed the door open and revealed a large room fitted with 2 small beds, easy chairs, a table on which books, magazines, newspapers lay. On the table, too, was fancy work, which, it was evident, had been as hastily laid aside as the sewing downstairs. Heatherwick bent over the things, but Rodmore went to the one window. "Jail, did I say?" he exclaimed. "Why, this is a jail. Look here, Mr. Heatherwick. Window mortised inside and fitted with iron bars outside. Even if whoever's been in here could have opened the window, and if there'd been no bars there, they couldn't have done anything, though, for there's nothing but a high blank wall opposite, back of some factory or other, apparently. But what's this?" he added, opening a door that stood in the corner. Small bathroom. And this," he continued, going to a square hatch set into the wall next to the staircase. "Ah, trap big enough to hand things like small trays through, but not big enough for a grown person to squeeze through. Well, I shouldn't wonder if you're right, Mr. Heatherwick. This, probably, is where these ladies were locked up. But they're gone." Heatherwick was looking around. Suddenly his eyes lighted on a familiar object. He stepped forward, and from a chair near one of the beds picked up a handbag of green silk. He knew it well enough. "That settles it," he exclaimed. "They have been here. This is Miss Featherstone's bag. I've seen her carry it often. These are her things in it, purse, card case, and so on. She's left it behind her." "Aye, just so," agreed Rodmore. "As I say, they all left in a hurry. I figure it out like this. The woman, who of course acted as a sort of jailer to these unfortunate ladies, when she made that discovery round yonder, came back here, got her outdoor things, and cleared off. But before she went, she'd the decency to slip up here, undo that chain, slip the bolt back, and turn the key. Then, no doubt, she made tracks at express speed, leaving the ladies to do what they liked. And they, Mr. Heatherwick, having a bit of common sense about 'em, did what I should have done. They hooked it as quick as possible. That's that, sir." Heatherwick thrust Rona's handbag into his pocket and made for the door. "Then I'm off, Robmore," he said. "I must try to find out where they've gone. I've an idea probably they'd go to Pentony's office. I'll go there. But you?" "Oh, I'm going back to Pencove Street," answered Robmore. "Plenty to do there. But off you go after the ladies, Mr. Heatherwick. There's nothing you can do round here now. I'll keep that clerk of yours a bit, and the Jew chap, they might come in. We shall have some nice revelations in the papers tomorrow morning, I'm thinking, especially if Matherfield has the luck he expects." "What are you going to do about this house?" asked Heatherwick, as they went downstairs. "Do you think the woman will come back?" "Bet your life she won't," answered Robmore. "Not she. I should think she's halfway across London, north, south, east, or west, by this. House? Why, I shall just lock the front door and put the key in my pocket. We shall want to search this house narrowly." Heatherwick bade him good day for the time being, and hurried off to Victoria Street to fling himself into the first disengaged taxicab he encountered, and to bid its driver go as speedily as possible to Lincoln's Inn Fields. He was anxious about Rona, and yet he felt that she was safe. And he was inquisitive, too. He wanted to hear her story, to find out what had happened behind the scenes. He felt sure of finding her at Pentony's office. She and Madame Lousterel, once released from their prison, would naturally go there. But the clerk whom he encountered as soon as he rushed into the outer office dampened his spirits at once by shaking his head. "Mr. Pentony's not in, sir," he answered. "He was in until not so long ago, but he got a telephone call and went out immediately afterwards. No, I don't know who it was that rang him up, Mr. Heatherwick, nor where he went. Seemed a bit excited when he went out, and was in a fearful hurry." Heatherwick concluded that Madame Lousterel had summoned Pentony, and that he had gone to meet her and Rona. He went away, somewhat at a loss. Then, remembering that Matherfield had promised to wire from Southampton, he turned towards his chambers. At the foot of the stairs he met his caretaker. "Been a young lady here inquiring for you, Mr. Heatherwick," said the man. "Been here twice. I said I didn't know when you'd be in any time. She said, but there is the young lady, sir, coming back." Heatherwick turned sharply and saw Rona coming across the square. Hurrying to meet her, and disregarding whatever eyes might be watching them, he took both her hands in his, in a fashion that brought the colour to her cheeks. "You're all right, safe?" he asked quickly. "Sure?" "I'm all right, and quite safe, thank you," she answered. I've been here twice before, but you were out. I came to borrow some money. I left my bag and purse in the place where we were locked up, and—" Heatherwick pulled out the handbag and silently gave it to her. She stared at him. "You've been there?" she exclaimed. "How?" "Got in this afternoon. An hour ago," he answered. "Here, come up to my rooms. We can't stand talking here. Madame Lousterel, where's she?" "I left her at Victoria, telephoning to Major Pentony," replied Rona. "She, too, had no money. She wanted me to wait until Major Pentony arrived, but I wouldn't. I walked here. I thought you'd want to know that we'd got out at last." Heatherwick said nothing until they had entered his sitting-room. Then, Staring silently at her, he put his hands on Rona's shoulders, and, after a long look at her, suddenly and impulsively bent and kissed her. "By gad," he said in a low voice, "I didn't know how anxious I was about you until I saw you just now, but now I know." Then, just as suddenly, he turned away from her and, in a matter-of-fact manner, lighted his stove, put on a kettle of water, and began preparations which indicated his intention of making tea. Rona, from an easy-chair into which he had unceremoniously thrust her, watched him. "Liberty," she said suddenly. "We're both discovering something. When you've been locked up day and night for a while—" "How was it?" he asked, turning on her. "Of course, we know all about the kidnapping, but the rest, until today. Basveri, of course?" "Basveri and another man," she answered. "A tall, clean-shaven man, whose name we never heard. But Basveri was the chief villain. As to how it was, they met us at the sunk road at Riversreed, forced us at the point of revolvers into a car, and drove us off to London, to Westminster, and into a house there, the house you've been in." "There?" "A moment," said Heatherwick, who was finding cups and saucers. "The driver of that car. He must have been an accomplice." "No doubt, but we never saw him again. We only saw those two, and a woman who acted as jailer and brought our meals. We were fed all right, and they gave us books and papers, and actually provided us with fancy work. But they were inexorable about Madame and her jewels. They must have known all about them, because they had got her own notepaper—" "I know all about that," said Heatherwick. "I'll tell you my side of it when you've had some tea." "Forced her, I suppose, to write the letters?" "They forced her to do that just as they forced us into the car," said Rona, "with revolvers. And they meant it. I suppose they've got the jewels now?" "Remains to be seen," said Heatherwick. "Did Madame Esterel happen to tell you what those jewels were worth?" "She talked about little else. Between 80 and 90,000 pounds. She's in an awful state about them. But it was literally a question of her life or her jewels. I don't know what they'd have done with me, but now I'm all right." Heatherwick opened a tin box, and, producing a plum cake, held it up for Rona to inspect. "What do you think of that for a cake?" he asked admiringly. "Present from my old aunt in the country. Real proper cake, that. Yes," he went on, setting the cake on the table. Yes, you're all right now. But, by George!" Rona said nothing. She saw that his relief at seeing her was greater and deeper than he cared to show. She poured out the tea. They sat discussing the recent events until dusky shadows began to fall over the whole room. "I ought to be getting back to Riversreed," she remarked at last. "It's late." "Wait a bit," said Heatherwick, who by that time had told her all he knew. "There'll be a wire from Matherfield before long. Don't go down to Riversreed tonight. Telephone to Lady Riversreed that you're staying in town. Her sister will be there by now, and will have told her everything. Wait till we get the wire from Matherfield. Then we'll go and dine somewhere, and you can put up at your old hotel in Surrey Street for the night. I want you to know what's happened at Southampton, and—" He broke off as a knock came at his outer door. "That'll be Matherfield's wire," he exclaimed. "Now then." A moment later he came back to her with the message in his hand. "It is from Matherfield," he said. "Handed in Southampton West 619. Doesn't say if he's got him. All he says is, 'Meet me Waterloo, arriving 8:20. Well, "I wonder," said Rona. "But Basveri is—" "Just what Robmore says," muttered Heatherwick. However, he looked at his watch. "Come along," he continued. "We've just time to get some dinner at Waterloo, and to be on the platform when the 8:20 comes in. If only we could see Basvely in charge of Matherfield and Crigman, it would give me an appetite." The vast space between the station buildings and the entrance to the platform at Waterloo was thronged when Heatherwick and Rona came out of the restaurant at 10 minutes past 8. Heatherwick was inquiring as to which platform the Southampton train would come in at, when he felt a light touch on his arm. Turning sharply, he saw Robmore. Robmore gave him a quiet smile, coupled with an informing wink. "Guess you're on the same job, Mr. Heatherwick," he said. "Wire from Matherfield, eh?" "Yes," replied Heatherwick. "And you?" "Same here," assented Robmore. "Just to say I was to be here for the 8:20, with help," he added significantly. "I've got the help. There's 4 of us roundabout. Heard anything of those ladies, Mr. Heatherwick?" "Here is one of them," replied Heatherwick, indicating Rona. "They're safe. You'll hear all about it later. But this business, what do you make of Matherfield's wire? Has he failed?" "I'll tell you what I make of it," answered Robmore. "I think you'll find that Basvely is on the train, with Matherfield and Crigman in close attendance. For some reason of his own, Matherfield means to arrest Basvely here. Here. That's how I figure it. They've seen Basvely there, and decided to follow him back to town. As soon as that train is in—" A sudden, sharp exclamation from Rona interrupted him, and made both men turn to her. She clutched Heatherwick's arm, at the same time pointing with the other hand across the space behind them. "Basvely himself," she said. "There, under that clock. See? He's going towards the gates." With a swift and unceremonious gesture, Robmore laid a hand on Rona's shoulder, twisted her round, and drew her amongst a group of bystanders. "Keep out of sight, miss," he muttered. "He'll know you. Now, again, which man? That with the pale face and high hat? I see him. Good to remember, too. All right. Stop here, you two. If he moves in this direction, Mr. Heatherwick, move away, anywhere. Wait." Robmore slipped away. A moment later, they saw him speak to a couple of quiet-looking men, who presently glanced at Basvely. Heatherwick was watching Basvely too. Basvely, quiet, unconcerned, evidently wholly unsuspicious, had taken up a position at the exit through which the Southampton passengers must emerge. He was smoking a cigar, placidly, with obvious appreciation. "You're certain that's the man?" whispered Heatherwick. "Basvely, positive," declared Rona, "as if I could mistake him. I've too good reason to remember his whole appearance. But here, daring." "Well," said Heatherwick, "something's going to happen. Keep back, keep well back. We can see things from here without being seen. If he caught sight of you—" Robmore came strolling back and joined them. "All right," he murmured. "4 pairs of eyes besides ours. That's 3 pairs more on him. My men are close up to him, too. See 'em? 1, 2, 3, 4. All round him, though he doesn't know. I shan't let him go, whether Matherfield turns up or not. Cool customer, eh?" "The train's due," said Heatherwick. He had Rona's hand within his arm, and he felt it tremble. "Yes," he whispered, bending down to her, "that's how I feel. Tense moment, this. But that scoundrel there—" Basvely was glancing at the big clock. He turned from it to the platform behind the gates, looking expectantly along its lighted surface. The others looked too. A minute passed. Then, out of the gloom at the further extremity of the vast station, an engine appeared, slowly dragging its burden of carriages, and came sighing like a weary giant up the side of the platform. The passengers in the front compartments leapt out and began filing towards the exit. "Now for it," muttered Robmore. "Keep back, you two. My men'll watch him, and whoever's here to meet him, for he's expecting somebody." Nothing happened for the first minute. The crowd of discharged passengers, men and women, civilians, soldiers, sailors, filed out and went their ways. Gradually it thinned. Then Heatherwick's arm was suddenly gripped by Rona for the second time, and he saw that she was staring at something beyond the barrier. "There!" she exclaimed. "There! The man in the grey coat and fawn hat. That's the man who drove the car. See? Basveri sees him." Heatherwick looked, and saw Basveri lift a hand in recognition of a young, fresh-faced man who was nearing the ticket collectors, and who carried in his right hand a small square parcel. But he saw more. Close behind this young man came Matherfield on one hand and Quigman on the other. They drew closer as he neared the gate, and on its other side the detectives drew closer to Basveri. "Now then," whispered Robmore, and stole swiftly forward. It was all over so swiftly that neither Heatherwick nor Rona knew exactly how the thing was done. Before they had realized that the men were trapped, or the gaping bystanders had realized that something was happening under their very noses, Basveri and his man were two safely handcuffed prisoners in the midst of a little group of silent men who were hurrying both away. Within a moment, captors and captives were lost in the outer reaches of the station. Then the two watchers suddenly realized that Matherfield, holding the square parcel in his hand, was standing close by, a grim but highly satisfied smile in his eyes. He held the parcel up before them. "Very neat, Mr. Heatherwick, very neat indeed," he said. "Uncommonly neat, eh?" But Heatherwick knew that he was not referring to the parcel. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of The Charing Cross Mystery by J.S. Fletcher. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Assurance. Rona went back to her old quarters at the little hotel in Surrey Street for that night, and next morning Heatherwick came round to her with an armful of newspapers. Finding her alone, he laid them on the table at her side, with a significant nod of his head at certain big black letters which topped the uppermost columns. "Matherfield must have given plenty of informing news to the pressmen last night," he remarked with a grim smile. "It's all in there. His own adventures at Southampton yesterday, mine and Robmore's in Westminster, and all the rest of it. I believe the newspaper people call this sort of thing a story, and a fine story it makes. Winding up, of course, with the dramatic arrest of Basveri at Waterloo. I'm afraid we're in for publicity for a time, worse luck." Shall I have to appear at that man's trial?" asked Rona. "That's unavoidable, I'm afraid, and at other things before that," answered Heatherwick. "There'll be the proceedings before the magistrate, and the adjourned inquest, and so on. Can't be helped, and there'll be some satisfaction in knowing that we're ridding the world of a peculiarly cruel and cold-blooded murderer. That chap Basveri is certainly as consummate a villain as I ever heard of. A human spider, and clever in his web-spinning. But I wish one had a few more particulars on one point, and yet I don't see how one's to get them." "What point?" asked Rona. "That sealed packet containing the details, or formula, or whatever it is, of your grandfather's invention," replied Heatherwick. "Where is it? What, precisely, is it? Did Ambrose get it from him? Has Basvery got it? So far as I can make out, the whole thing began with that. Whether it was really worth a farthing or a fortune, your grandfather brought to London something which he honestly believed to be of great value. And there's no doubt that he got into the hands of those two men, Ambrose and Basvery, because of it. There's no doubt either that in conversation with them he told them, perhaps jokingly, what he knew about Madame Listorel. Nor is there any doubt that these two murdered him. Nor is there any doubt in my mind as to how they murdered him. You must remember that both men were trained medical men, and obviously of a scientific turn of mind into the bargain. Each had doubtless made a deep study of poisons. Such a knowledge is of value to such men as they were, men of criminal tendencies. Probably they knew of a subtle poison, easily administered, the effects of which would not be evident for some hours. No doubt they timed their work so that their victim should die swiftly and suddenly when well away from their laboratory. And, of course, they did the same thing in the case of Granite. Granite paid the penalty of being with your grandfather. But for what did they murder your grandfather? Did they get rid of him so that they could keep his secret about Madame Listorel to themselves and blackmail her and her sister? Or that they could rob him of his invention and turn it to their own profit? If the latter, then— He paused, looking inquiringly at Rona as if he expected her to see what he was after. But Rona shook her head. "I don't follow," she said. "What then?" "This," replied Heatherwick. "If their desire to get hold of grandfather's secret was their motive, then that secret's worth a lot of money which ought to come to you. Don't you see? Where is the secret? Where's the sealed packet? I suppose the police would search Basvery last night. Perhaps they found it on him. We shall hear. But, anyway, it's yours." Rona made a gesture of aversion. "I should hate to touch or have anything to do with it if it had been in that man's possession," she said. "But I don't think there's any doubt that they murdered my grandfather because of that secret. Only I think, too, they'd a double motive. The secret about Madame Listorel was their second string. Probably they believed that Lady Riversreed would be an easy prey, and I think she would have been if she hadn't had Major Pentony to fall back on. I know she was dreadfully upset after Basvery's first visit. So I put it this way. Always have done, though they thought they could sell grandfather's invention for a lot of money and get another lot out of Lady Riversreed and Madame Listorel as blackmail." "Black money indeed, all of it," exclaimed Heatherwick. "Well?" A woman servant put her head into the little parlour in which they were sitting and looked significantly at Rona. "There's a policeman downstairs, miss, asking for you," she announced. "Leastways, he wants to know if you can tell him if Mr. Heatherwick's here, or been here." Heatherwick went to the head of the stair. A policeman, standing in the hall below, looked up and touched his helmet. "Inspector Matherfield's compliments, sir. And could you step round and bring Miss Hannaford with you?" he asked. "There's new developments, Mr. Heatherwick. Important." "We'll come at once," assented Heatherwick. 10 minutes." He went back and hurried Rona away. "What now?" he asked, as they hastened towards Matherfield's office. "Perhaps they've extracted something out of Basvery. Or possibly the newspapers have attracted the attention of somebody who can give further news. The last suggestion strengthened itself when, on entering Matherfield's room, they found him closeted with two strangers, whose appearance was that of responsible and well-to-do commercial men. All three were discovered in what looked like a serious and deep conversation, and Heatherwick was quick to notice that the two unknown men looked at Rona with unusual interest. Matherfield made haste to introduce her as the late ex-superintendent Hannaford's granddaughter, and Heatherwick as a gentleman who had been much concerned in the recent proceedings. These gentlemen, Miss Hannaford and Mr. Heatherwick, he proceeded, waving his hand at the others, are Messrs. Cuthwaite and Houseover, manufacturing chemists of Eastham. Incidentally, they've also a big place in Lancashire. And having seen this morning's paper, in which you've no doubt noticed there's a good deal about our affair, they've come straight to me with some news which will prove uncommonly useful when Basveli is put in the dock before the magistrate this afternoon. The fact is, Mr. Heatherwick, these gentlemen have supplied a missing link. What link? Asked Heatherwick eagerly. Matherfield nodded at the elder of the two men, Cuthwaite, who produced a pocket-book and extracted from it a sheet of paper. Silently, he passed it over to Matherfield, who turned to Rona. Now, Miss Hannaford, he said, with a note of triumph in his voice, I dare say you can positively identify your grandfather's handwriting and his way of making figures. Can you swear that this has been written by him? Rona gave but one glance at the paper before looking up with a glance of positive assertion. Oh, yes, she exclaimed. That is his writing, without a doubt. Nothing could be more certain. Matherfield turned to Heatherwick. That's the formula for the ink, he said. Now we've got the big thing we wanted, and Mr. Cuthwaite will tell you how he got it. Cuthwaite, after allowing Heatherwick to look at the paper, carefully replaced it in his pocket-book. There was an air of anxiety about him, and about his partner, concerning which Heatherwick began to make guesses. They looked as if they were uncertain and uneasy, but Cuthwaite was ready enough to tell his story. We got it in this way, he said, and I may as well say, as I've already said to you, Mr. Matherfield, that I don't think we should have got it at all if your police people hadn't been so reticent on that one particular point. If you'd noised it abroad about Hannaford's secret, we might have been forewarned. However, some little time ago, a man whom we knew as Basing, and whom I firmly believe to be the Basveli that we've read about in the papers this morning, a man, mind you, that we'd done business with now and then during the last year or so, came to us and offered us the formula for a new black ink which he asserted would drive every known ink off the market all over the world. He made extravagant claims for it. He swore it was the first absolutely perfect writing fluid ever invented. He brought a sample of it, which he'd made up himself. He put it to various tests. But he did more. He offered us the use of the secret formula so that we ourselves could make and test it before deciding whether we'd fall in with his suggestion, which was that we should offer him a lump cash sum for the formula. Well, we did make the ink from the formula, and we did test it, and there is no doubt about it. It is all, and perhaps more, than Basing or Basveli claimed for its excellence. I needn't go into the drawbacks attaching to most well-known inks. This has none of them. And when Basing came back to us a few days ago, we decided to buy the formula from him. We agreed upon a cash price, and day before yesterday we paid the amount over at our office in Eastham. Yes, said Heatherwick quietly. And what was the price agreed upon? The two partners exchanged a glance. It seemed to Rona, who was watching them intently, that they looked more uneasy than before, but Cuthwaite replied with promptitude. £10,000. How did you pay him? Asked Heatherwick. In cash? No, by open cheque, at his own request. That, of course, was as good as cash. But, continued Cuthwaite, as soon as we read the newspapers this morning, we, that is, I, for I read the whole thing on my way to business, went at once to our bank to see if the cheque had been cashed. It had, an hour or two after we'd handed it to Basing. He'd taken the amount in Bank of England notes. Heatherwick looked at Matherfield. Of course, he remarked, as if he were asking a question, that formula belongs to Miss Hannaford? Basvely had no right to sell it. He stole it. That's the fact, Mr. Heatherwick, assented Matherfield. These gentlemen, innocently enough, bought stolen property. But I've just told them something that I'll tell you now. We found the money, notes, on Basvely last night, intact, in his pocket-book. Of course, with that, and the jewels which his accomplice succeeded in getting at Southampton, he'd got a nice haul. But now we can easily prove how he came by that 10,000, and it'll go back to Messrs. Cuthwaite and Houseover there. We can prove, too, from their evidence, that Basvely poisoned Mr. Hannaford for the sake of that formula. Basvely's done. These gentlemen will recover their £10,000, then? Said Heatherwick. In that case, he turned to the two partners. I don't see that you've anything to worry about, he suggested. The formula, of course, must be handed over to... Well, now, that's just it, Mr. Heatherwick, interrupted the partner, who until then had kept silent. The fact is, sir, we don't want to lose that formula. We gave this man Baring, or Basvely, £10,000 for it, but you really believe it to be worth more, eh? Said Heatherwick with a smile. I see. Then in that case, if we get back our 10,000, sir, we shall be pleased to treat with the rightful owner, said Cuthwaite, after an exchange of looks with his partner. In the meantime, the formula is safe and secret with us. We are well-known people. We'll leave it at that just now, answered Heatherwick. Miss Hannaford will trust you to keep your word about safety and secrecy, and later, business. He got up, and Rona rose with him. Shall you want us today, Matherfield? He asked. If not... No, replied Matherfield. Merely formal business today. Then this afternoon he'll be brought up. Only evidence of arrest and application of adjournment. You can go away, Mr. Heatherwick. We'll let you both know when you're wanted. Heatherwick let Rona out, and once clear of the police precincts, smote his stick on the pavement. When we're through with this business, I'm hanged if I ever dabble in crime affairs again, personally, he exclaimed. Basvely has been a pretty vile example to tackle. And that you should be dragged into it, too, he added suddenly. That upset me more than anything. However, it's getting to an end. And then... He paused, while she looked up at him with a little wonder at his vehemence. Then, and as they were at the moment walking along a quiet stretch of the less frequented side of the embankment, she timidly laid a hand on his arm. He turned sharply, laying his hand on hers. I think you've been very considerate and thoughtful for me, she said. After all, it wasn't quite mere interest in crime that made you... Good Lord, no, he exclaimed quickly. At first, perhaps, half that, half you. I felt, somehow, that I'd got to look after you. And then, and when you disappeared... But I believe I'm a bit muddle-headed. I'll tell you something.
all that time that you were lost, I scarcely ever slept, wondering, and when you turned up yesterday afternoon. But I want to ask you something that I'm not quite clear about. I was certainly muddled just then." "What is it?" she asked. Heatherwick bent down to her and dropped his voice. "I was so glad, so relieved to see you yesterday afternoon," he said, that I felt dazed, And I want to know, did I kiss you?" Rona suddenly looked up at him and laughed. "Oh, how really amusing you are! Why, of course you did. Twice." "That's good," he exclaimed. I thought perhaps I had dreamt it. But did you kiss me?" "Do you really want to be dead sure?" asked Rona mischievously. "Very well, I did." "That's better," said Heatherwick. End of chapter 27. Recording by Kirsten Wever. End of The Charing Cross Mystery by J. S. Fletcher.